The Harrington estate stood like a palace on the outskirts of Charleston, a sweeping colonial mansion of marble pillars and cascading fountains, surrounded by acres of manicured lawns and whispering oak trees. To those who passed by its iron gates, it was the image of perfection, wealth, power, and prestige distilled into stone. But those who worked within its walls knew better. Beneath the chandeliers and polished floors lay a silence so heavy it could smother the soul. Ever since the death of Amelia Harrington, the mistress of the house, that silence had deepened. Once a place of laughter and music, the mansion now echoed only with footsteps and whispered orders. The grand piano in the parlor gathered dust. The silver tea set, once used for afternoon gatherings, remained locked in a cabinet. The master, Edward Harrington, one of the richest men in South Carolina, buried himself in his company's affairs, rarely returning home before midnight. His grief had hardened into something cold and impenetrable, a fortress of denial. And within that fortress lived two fragile twins, only 9 months old, with eyes like their mother's and hearts too delicate for a house so empty. They were the heirs to an empire, but they had no mother to cradle them and no father to soothe them when they cried. Their nursery was bright and expensive, pastel walls, lace curtains, and a golden cradle, but love could not be bought, and warmth could not be ordered. Among the many servants in the house was a quiet woman named Clara Johnson. She was in her late 20s, a poor black maid from the outskirts of town, hired only months earlier through an agency that barely paid her enough to live. She moved through the mansion with the precision of someone afraid to make mistakes. Every sound she made seemed too loud in those hollow corridors, the creak of a mop handle, the sweep of a broom, the faint clink of dishes in the sink. Clara knew her place. She wasn't allowed to speak unless spoken to. The head butler, Mr. Wallace, made sure of that. "You're here to clean, not to care," he had told her on her first day, his sharp eyes narrowing beneath his spectacles. Yet, every time she passed the nursery door and heard the faint sound of a baby crying, her heart ached. She had grown up poor but rich in compassion, raised by a grandmother who used to say, "Child, love don't need no title. It just needs a heart big enough to give." Each day after finishing her chores, Clara would quietly peek through the nursery door. The twins, Eleanor and Henry, were always tended to by a different nurse, each lasting barely a week. Most couldn't handle the pressure, the long hours, or the fear of displeasing Mr. Harrington. They came and went, leaving the children confused and restless. Sometimes, Clara found little Eleanor's blanket kicked off or Henry's bottle left empty for hours. She wasn't supposed to interfere, but when no one was looking, she would sneak in, tuck them in gently, and whisper a prayer. The housekeeper, Mrs. Lane, noticed once and warned her. "Don't let the master catch you near those children. He don't like the help getting too familiar." Clara nodded, but the ache in her chest didn't go away. At night, when the rest of the staff gathered in the basement kitchen for supper, she often sat by the small window, gazing out at the glowing windows of the nursery above. Sometimes, she thought she saw the faint flicker of movement, the babies stirring, the dim light swaying. She prayed someone was with them. The mansion had every luxury: imported marble from Italy, antique clocks from France, chandeliers from Vienna, yet, to Clara, it felt like a tomb. Every surface gleamed, but it reflected emptiness. The portraits of Edward and Amelia hung side by side in the grand hallway, their smiles frozen forever. She sometimes stopped in front of them while dusting, looking up at Amelia's kind face. "Ma'am," she'd whisper softly, "I'll look after them. When I can. I promise." Downstairs, the hierarchy among the staff was strict. The butler ruled the household, the cooks whispered gossip, and the maids worked themselves weary. But Clara's quiet nature made her invisible, a blessing and a curse. No one noticed when she lingered too long near the nursery. No one cared when she saved a crust of bread to send home to her mother, who was bedridden in a little cabin far from the city. Every week, half her pay went into an envelope addressed to Mama Johnson, Greenville County. One afternoon, while scrubbing the grand staircase, she overheard a conversation between two footmen. "The master's leaving again tonight," one said. "New deal in New York. Won't be back till the weekend. The twins'll be left with that new nurse again," the other muttered. She looked scared half to death. Clara's hand tightened on the brush. She didn't know why her heart sank every time Mr. Harrington left, perhaps because the house grew even colder, the silence deeper. That evening, as the clock struck 7, she saw the sleek black car roll down the driveway, taillights fading into the mist. The storm clouds gathered overhead. The air smelled like rain. The new nurse, a nervous young woman named Miss Turner, paced the nursery, glancing anxiously at the windows that rattled with each gust. Clara finished her chores, wiped her hands, and quietly offered, "Would you like me to help with the twins before I leave?" Miss Turner shook her head sharply. "No, thank you. Mr. Wallace wouldn't like that." So Clara retreated to her small attic room, but she couldn't rest. The thunder grew louder, and the wind howled like something alive. The sound of it pressed against the walls. She thought she heard a faint cry from above, or was it the wind again? She couldn't tell. She sat up, her heart uneasy. Down in the great hall, the grandfather clock struck 10. Its solemn chime echoed through the mansion like a warning. Somewhere upstairs, one of the twins began to cry, faint at first, then louder, desperate. Clara hesitated only a second before throwing on her shawl and hurrying out into the corridor. The house seemed endless in the dark. Shadows stretched across the walls, lightning flickering through tall windows. As she reached the nursery door, she froze. Miss Turner was gone. The cradle rocked weakly under the leaking window, cold rain spattering across the floor. Both babies were crying now. Clara's breath caught. She stepped forward, whispering, "Hush now, I'm here." Her voice trembled, but it was filled with warmth. She closed the window, wiped the water from the sill, and gathered the twins into her arms. Their skin was icy, their tiny bodies shaking. The fire had gone out, and there were no extra blankets in sight. Clara looked around. No one was coming. No one cared. So she did the only thing her heart told her to do. She laid down on the floor, wrapped both babies in her shawl, and pressed them close against her chest. The marble beneath her was freezing, but their cries softened, their breathing steadied. As thunder rumbled outside, Clara began to hum an old lullaby, her grandmother's song, a tune about angels watching over children in the dark. The storm raged, but inside that cold, golden house, love, simple, wordless, and pure, burned quietly on the floor. And that night, without knowing it, she changed everything. The storm broke loose over Charleston like the heavens themselves had torn open. Rain battered the great windows of the Harrington estate, and lightning slashed across the sky, flooding the marble corridors with quick flashes of blue-white light. In the nursery, the soft lull of the house's grandeur had been replaced by something raw and unguarded, the trembling cries of two children left in a room too big for comfort, too lonely for warmth. Clara stirred on the cold floorboards. She hadn't meant to fall asleep there, but her body had given in to exhaustion. Her shawl clung damply to her shoulders, and in her arms, the twins lay nestled close, one with his tiny hand gripping her collar, the other resting her cheek against Clara's chest, listening to the faint rhythm of her heart. The fire had long gone out, leaving only the whisper of rain and the occasional groan of thunder. Outside, the mansion moaned with the weight of the storm. The wind pressed against the tall windows as if trying to get in. From the hallway came the faint creak of the butler's steps, pacing in agitation, his lantern flickering through the crack under the nursery door. But he didn't dare enter. The servants had already whispered about the scene they'd found earlier, the maid sleeping beside the heirs. Wallace wanted to wait for Mr. Harrington's return before deciding what to do. For now, Clara and the babies were left undisturbed, unseen, as the night deepened. Clara stirred, sensing one of the twins move. Little Eleanor whimpered softly, her eyelids fluttering. Clara lifted her head, whispering, "Shoo, now, baby, it's just thunder, don't you cry." Her voice was low and tender, carrying the weight of years of lullabies sung in wooden cabins and church basements where love was the only heat against the cold. She shifted to make the children more comfortable, her joints aching from the hard floor. The marble beneath her had leached the warmth from her bones, but she didn't move them. There. Safety mattered more than her comfort. She could bear the cold, she had known worse. Her thoughts wandered to her own childhood, to the nights when rain would leak through the roof of their shack and her grandmother would pull her close, whispering, "God's storms don't mean he's angry, child. Sometimes he just wants us to listen." So Clara listened, to the storm, to the faint breathing of the twins, to the heavy silence that filled the house beyond the nursery. Somewhere in that vast silence, she could almost feel the ghost of Amelia Harrington. She had seen the portrait, the soft smile, the kind eyes. It wasn't hard to imagine that the late mistress would have approved of what Clara was doing now. The lightning flared again, and for a moment the nursery was bathed in ghostly light, the rocking chair casting long shadows on the wall, the golden cradle glimmering like a forgotten relic. Then darkness returned, thick and unbroken. Clara exhaled slowly, her breath trembling. She whispered a prayer under her breath. "Lord, keep these little ones safe. They ain't got no mama, and their daddy's heart too heavy to see them right now. So I'll hold them till the morning comes." It was a simple prayer, but it filled the room like a quiet promise. Downstairs, in the servant quarters, Miss Turner sat at the edge of her bed, pale and anxious. She had left her post hours earlier, frightened by the storm, unwilling to stay alone with the crying infants. "No one will notice," she had told herself. "Just till the morning." But guilt gnawed at her now. Every thunderclap made her flinch. She didn't know that upstairs, the woman she had dismissed as just the maid was doing her job for her, and more. As midnight approached, the storm worsened. Water dripped from the edges of the windowpane, pooling on the floor near Clara's feet. She could feel her skirt clinging to her legs, her fingers numb. But when she looked down at the sleeping faces of the twins, peace flickered across her tired face. Eleanor's lips parted in a small sigh. Henry's tiny chest rose and fell in rhythm with hers. For that moment, they were her own. Lightning cracked again, closer this time. The sound jolted Clara fully awake. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the children, and adjusted the shawl around them. Their warmth had become her anchor in the cold, her purpose in a world that otherwise didn't see her. And yet, even as she looked at them, she felt a shiver of dread. What would happen when morning came? She wasn't supposed to be here. A maid lying beside the master's children was a scandal waiting to ignite. The thought sent a wave of fear through her chest. But then, she remembered their cries, the way they had clung to her in the dark, and her resolve hardened. "If they fire me," she murmured, "then so be it. I'd rather lose a job than lose a soul." Hours passed. The rain softened, the thunder moved away. The first pale light of dawn crept into the room, turning the storm's rage into a gentle patter against the window. Clara blinked, her eyes burning from fatigue. She had drifted in and out of shallow sleep, always waking at the slightest sound. Her hair clung to her face, and her hands were rough and chilled. But the babies slept soundly, their cheeks flushed, their tiny fists relaxed. The moment was still when it happened, the quiet knock on the door. Then the handle turned. Clara's eyes snapped open. Mr. Wallace stepped in, his face severe, his expression sharp with disapproval. The lantern in his hand cast a narrow beam of light across the room, and what he saw made him stiffen. There, on the cold marble floor, lay the maid, her back against the cradle, her arms encircling the twin heirs of the Harrington fortune. Their soft breaths mingled with hers. The golden shawl that covered them was soaked through, the hem of her uniform torn where she had knelt. For a long moment, the butler said nothing. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He had served the Harrington family for 30 years, seen tragedy and luxury in equal measure, but this image, unsettled something deep in him. He turned abruptly and left, his shoes echoing down the hallway. But his mind churned. Should he wake the master immediately? Should he call the nurse back? Scandal was the one thing Edward Harrington despised most. As Clara stirred again, the first beam of sunrise broke through the clouds, spilling soft gold across the nursery. She opened her eyes, dazed but peaceful. The light touched the twins' faces, making their tiny curls glow like halos. Clara smiled faintly. "The storm's done, babies," she whispered. "You see, the morning always comes." Unbeknownst to her, the morning would bring something else, not peace, but a reckoning. For at that very moment, far away on the rain-slicked highway, Edward Harrington's car was speeding toward home, the letter from his butler already in his pocket. He would arrive before noon, carrying with him a heart too proud to understand what love truly meant, until he saw it, lying humbly on the floor beside his children. The storm outside had passed. But inside the walls of that mansion, another storm was about to begin. The morning arrived like a reluctant guest, gray, cold, and eerily still after the night's tempest. The rain had stopped, but the world beyond the tall windows of the Harrington estate was veiled in fog. Every tree branch dripped with silver drops that shimmered in the faint dawn light. The mansion, however, remained heavy with silence, the kind of silence that follows a storm, when even nature seems to hold its breath. In the nursery, the faint glow of morning seeped through the curtains, revealing the scene that would soon set the entire household whispering. Clara stirred awake, her body stiff from the cold marble floor. The ache in her back was sharp, her limbs half numb, but she didn't move right away. Instead, she looked down at the two small faces pressed against her arms. The twins were still asleep, peaceful, warm, and safe. Eleanor's tiny hand rested against Henry's cheek, their breathing soft and rhythmic. The sight filled Clara's weary heart with quiet relief. She smiled faintly, brushing a stray curl from Eleanor's forehead. "You made it through the storm, little ones," she whispered. "Your mama's proud of you, I know she is." But then she heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming closer. Her heart leapt. Before she could even rise, the nursery door creaked open, spilling a sliver of light across the floor. Mr. Wallace, the butler, stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Behind him hovered Mrs. Lane, the housekeeper, clutching her apron. Their eyes widened at what they saw, the maid lying on the floor beside the heir and heiress of the Harrington fortune. Mrs. Lane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Lord have mercy." Mr. Wallace's jaw tightened. "Get the nurse," he hissed. Within minutes, whispers rippled through the mansion like wildfire. She slept beside them, one maid muttered in disbelief. On the floor, another exclaimed. Some shook their heads in pity, others in fear. To them, it wasn't an act of love, it was a scandal, a breach of class, a sin of proximity. Clara, still half kneeling, tried to explain. "The storm, they were cold, I didn't mean no harm." Her voice trembled, but her eyes held steady compassion. Mrs. Lane's tone softened. "Child, you should have called someone." "I did," Clara whispered. "No one came." That simple truth landed like a stone in the quiet room. The housekeeper looked away, ashamed. She knew it was true. During the storm, everyone had hidden in their quarters, afraid of the master's temper or too tired to care. But Mr. Wallace was not moved. "You've overstepped your place, Miss Johnson," he said curtly. "The master will hear of this." He turned sharply, signaling two maids to retrieve the children. Clara hesitated, unwilling to let go, but she knew resistance would only make things worse. Gently, she handed the twins over, her heart twisting as their warmth left her arms. Eleanor whimpered, reaching toward Clara, and the sight nearly broke her. As the nursery emptied, she stood alone, staring at the damp shawl on the floor. Her hands trembled. She could still feel the weight of the children against her, their fragile trust resting in her arms. For the first time in years, tears welled in her eyes, quiet tears that she quickly wiped away with her sleeve. She had done the right thing, she told herself. Even if no one else understood. Downstairs, the servants gathered like a storm of their own. The air buzzed with gossip and fear. Miss Turner, the nurse, paled when she heard. "She what?" she stammered. "But I was going to return in the morning." Mr. Wallace glared at her. "You deserted your post, Miss Turner. Be grateful I don't report you." The nurse fell silent, trembling. By mid-morning, the fog outside had begun to lift, revealing the long, glistening driveway. A black car appeared through the mist, tires crunching over the wet gravel. Edward Harrington was home. The moment word reached the servants' quarters, tension rippled through the house. Doors straightened. Uniforms were adjusted. The master of the mansion was not a man one greeted casually. He was known for his composure, his authority, and his temper. The front doors opened with a sharp echo. Edward stepped in, tall and severe in his black coat, his hair slicked back, his expression unreadable. He carried the air of a man who commanded respect everywhere he went. But behind that polished exterior lingered the fatigue of grief and sleepless nights. "Mr. Wallace," he said without pause, handing off his gloves. "Report." The butler hesitated, his composure cracking slightly. "There's been an incident, sir. In the nursery." Edward stopped mid-step. "An incident?" His tone was calm, but cold. "Are the children hurt?" "No, sir. Quite the opposite, in fact. But, the maid, the new one, Clara Johnson, was found this morning," he faltered, searching for the right words. "Asleep beside the twins. On the nursery floor." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Edward turned slowly, his face hardening. "She what?" "She claims it was out of concern for the children, sir." "The storm." "I don't care about her claims," Edward snapped. "Where is she?" Within moments, Clara was brought before him in the grand hall. She stood at the base of the sweeping staircase, her uniform wrinkled, her shawl still damp from the night before. The light from the high windows poured down like judgment. Edward's eyes locked onto her. "You were in the nursery. On the floor. With my children?" Clara's voice was small but steady. "Yes, sir." "Why?" "They were crying. The window was leaking. It was cold. I just wanted to keep them safe." Edward's expression darkened. "Safe? You think it's your place to touch what doesn't belong to you?" The word struck like a whip. The servants nearby flinched. Clara's throat tightened, but she stood her ground. "Children belong to no one, sir. They belong to love." The room went still. Even the butler's jaw dropped at her audacity. Edward's eyes flashed, anger, disbelief, and something else, something that flickered too quickly to name. Before he could respond, a cry echoed from upstairs, high and sharp. The sound of a child in distress. Everyone turned. Without thinking, Clara moved first, her instincts overtaking fear. She rushed up the staircase, her skirts brushing the banister. Edward followed, fury and confusion burning behind him. In the nursery, chaos awaited. Little Henry had turned blue in the face, choking on his own spit as he struggled to breathe. The nurse froze, paralyzed with terror. Clara scooped him up in a single motion, her voice calm and sure. "Easy now, baby. Breathe. That's it, sweet boy." She turned him gently over her arm, patting his back in steady rhythm. Within seconds, Henry coughed and gasped, the color returning to his cheeks. The room exhaled with relief. Edward stood frozen at the door, his fury gone, replaced by something else entirely, shock, awe, and shame. He had seen his own servant stand still while this woman, the one he had been ready to dismiss, had saved his son's life without hesitation. Clara looked up, tears in her eyes but resolve in her voice. "You see, sir," she whispered softly, "sometimes the floor is the only place love can reach from." And in that moment, amidst the echo of rain still dripping from the windowsill and the fragile sound of two children breathing safely in her arms, Edward Harrington's world shifted, though he didn't yet understand how deeply. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Only the soft wheeze of baby Henry filled the air, the sound of life returning to the small chest that had almost gone still. The fire in the nursery crackled weakly, its embers flickering against the shadowed walls. Edward Harrington stood frozen near the door, his gloved hands still clenched into fists. The world, for a moment, had stopped turning. The rain outside had thinned into a mist, but within him, a different kind of storm brewed, one made not of thunder, but of pride, shame, and disbelief. Clara still held the baby close to her chest, rocking him gently. Her face glistened with tears, not from fear, but from relief. The other twin, Eleanor, stirred in her cradle, cooing faintly, as if unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. The nurse, Miss Turner, hovered uselessly near the window, her face pale and her hands shaking. She had frozen when the child began to choke, the sight of danger had rooted her to the floor. And yet this maid, this poor woman who had slept on marble and eaten scraps, had stepped forward without a second thought. Edward's voice, when it came, was low but sharp. "Put him down." Clara hesitated, her arms tightening instinctively around the infant. Edward took a step forward, his voice rising. "I said put him down." She turned slowly, meeting his eyes, not with defiance, but with something steadier. "He's all right now, sir," she said softly. "Just needed to be held right." For a fleeting second, their eyes locked, his cold, hers warm. It was the collision of two worlds, one built on walls of wealth, the other on the humble strength of compassion. Edward stepped closer, his breath uneven. "You had no right to touch my child. No right to enter that room last night. Do you understand that?" Clara stood silent. Her heart pounded, but she did not flinch. "Sir," she began gently, "if I hadn't gone in, your boy wouldn't be breathing right now." The words struck like lightning. The butler and housekeeper, standing by the door, exchanged uneasy glances. Even Miss Turner seemed to shrink into herself, shame flickering across her face. Edward's jaw tightened. He turned away, pacing the room, his reflection flickering in the tall mirror. "You think that excuses your behavior," he said finally. "Do you know what it means for a servant to cross that line? You disgraced the order of this household." Clara lowered her gaze. "I didn't mean no disgrace, sir. Only care. Care." Edward's tone cracked, the first hint of emotion seeping through. "You presume to know what care means in this house. My wife," he stopped abruptly, his voice catching on the word wife. It was the first time he'd spoken of her in months. Clara's eyes softened. "Your wife would have held them too, sir." The room fell completely silent. Even the fire seemed to hush. Edward turned, staring at her as if she had struck him. For a heartbeat, something raw flickered across his face, grief, buried too long under arrogance and control. But just as quickly, he smothered it. "Leave," he said coldly. "Before I change my mind about having you dismissed quietly." Clara took a breath, holding the baby one last moment before laying him gently back into his cradle. She brushed a finger across Henry's cheek. "You be good now, little one," she whispered. "The world's gonna be kinder than this room, I promise." Then she turned toward the door, her posture steady though her eyes shone with unshed tears. As she passed Edward, he spoke again, quieter, but colder. "You will collect your wages and leave before sundown. I don't ever want to see you in this house again." Clara paused, her fingers tightening around her shawl. "If that's your wish, sir, I'll go. But I'll go knowing I did right by your children." Edward said nothing. His silence was a wall, one she could never climb. She walked out of the nursery with the weight of a condemned woman, her footsteps soft against the Persian rug. Mrs. Lane followed her to the servants' quarters, trying to console her, but Clara barely heard. Her thoughts were still upstairs, with the children she'd rocked through the storm. Down the hall, Edward remained motionless, staring at the cradle. The twins had settled again, both sleeping peacefully. His reflection in the window looked like a stranger, a man who had almost lost everything and hadn't even known it. The butler cleared his throat. "Sir, perhaps it would be wise to reconsider." "Enough, Wallace," Edward snapped. "I won't be lectured in my own house." He turned away, but his composure was already cracking. He loosened his tie, sat in the chair beside the cradle, and stared at the small faces before him. His mind replayed the moment, Clara's hand steady on the child's back, her trembling whisper, the way she had placed herself between his children and danger without hesitation. She had done what he, their father, could not. The truth burned through him. He felt something unfamiliar, shame, humility. He had prided himself on control, on order, on keeping emotion locked away. Yet in that single act, the maid had undone him. Downstairs, the servants murmured in the kitchen. "She'll be gone before supper," one whispered. "Fired for caring too much." "It's not fair," said another. "She saved that boy's life." But fairness had little place in a house like this. As the day wore on, the fog outside began to lift completely, revealing a pale sun struggling to break through the clouds. Clara packed her small bag, a change of clothes, a Bible, and a faded photograph of her mother. She paused once to look back up the grand staircase, her heart heavy but steady. Just as she turned to leave, a faint cry drifted from upstairs, a baby's cry. Then another. It echoed down the marble hall. Haunting and insistent. She froze. The sound sliced straight through her resolve. Meanwhile, in the nursery, Edward sat helplessly as both twins cried louder. He tried to soothe them, awkwardly patting their backs, but their cries only deepened. He had never learned how to hold them, how to comfort them. He was a man of ledgers and meetings, not lullabies. And then, in the reflection of the nursery mirror, he saw her, Clara, standing hesitantly in the doorway, clutching her shawl. She hadn't been able to walk away. Their eyes met again, but this time there was no anger between them, only silence and something unspoken. Without a word, Clara stepped forward, gently took Eleanor from the cradle, and began to hum. The same lullaby from the night before, soft, steady, a melody that seemed to hush even the storm inside him. The twins quieted almost instantly. The room filled with peace. Edward stood there, speechless, as realization dawned. All the wealth in his world, all the rules he'd built, meant nothing beside this simple act of love. When the song ended, Clara turned to leave again. But this time, Edward didn't stop her, nor could he speak. He simply watched, humbled, as she disappeared down the hall, her song echoing faintly behind her. It would take him hours to understand what he had truly witnessed. And by nightfall, the man who had once believed love was a weakness would sit alone in the nursery, staring at the empty chair beside the cradle, knowing deep down, he had just let something sacred walk out his door. By the time dusk fell over the Harrington estate, the world outside was painted in streaks of rose and gold, the kind of twilight that makes everything look softer than it truly is. Yet inside the mansion, no warmth reached Edward Harrington's heart. He sat alone in his study, the glow from the fireplace flickering across the mahogany desk, his mind a storm far louder than the one that had battered the house the night before. On the polished wood before him lay the morning's events like a crime scene in his mind, the image of a maid kneeling on the nursery floor, the sound of his son's desperate choking, and the echo of her steady, tender voice. He had dismissed her out of pride, his sense of order bruised by what he saw as disobedience. But the longer he sat in silence, the more her words haunted him. Children belong to love. He had spent years believing that love was something ornamental, beautiful but unnecessary, a weakness that distracted a man from his duty. After Amelia's death, he had hardened himself into something unrecognizable, hiding behind wealth and schedules. Yet, when he had looked at Clara holding his child, he had seen something that stripped him bare. Outside, the last light faded, and the house grew still. The butler entered quietly, carrying a silver tray. "Your supper, sir." Edward waved it away. "Leave it." Mr. Wallace lingered, the lines in his face drawn tight. He had served Edward's father before him, had watched the family rise to wealth and tragedy alike. He hesitated, then said, "Sir, if I may speak plainly, the maid, Miss Johnson, she meant no harm. She acted with heart, not insolence." Edward's gaze lifted, sharp but not angry. "You defend her?" "I do, sir. Because she saved your son." Edward leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. And yet she overstepped. Wallace took a breath. Perhaps she did. But maybe this house needs someone willing to overstep for the sake of what's right. The words lingered long. After the butler left, Edward rose, pacing the length of the room. The portraits of his ancestors lined the walls, proud faces, cold eyes. Men who had built fortunes and guarded them with iron discipline. None of them had ever knelt beside a cradle. None had understood the kind of love that required humility. For the first time, he wondered if that legacy had poisoned him, if his own grief had turned him into one of those marble statues, untouched by compassion. He poured himself a drink, then stopped, the amber liquid catching the firelight. He remembered how Clara had stood, soaked and trembling, clutching his children with her whole being. She hadn't asked for recognition or gratitude. She hadn't even defended herself when accused. She had simply done what needed to be done, what he had failed to do. The truth struck hard. He had fired the one person in this entire house who had shown his children genuine love. At that very moment, somewhere in the servants' quarters, Clara sat on the edge of her narrow bed, a small satchel packed at her feet. The other maids watched from the doorway, their faces a mix of sympathy and quiet admiration. She folded her shawl neatly, her fingers brushing the frayed edges. "You'll find better work, Clara," Mrs. Lane said softly. "You did nothing wrong." Clara smiled faintly, though her eyes were tired. "It's not about wrong or right, ma'am. It's about what a person can sleep within their soul at night." She glanced toward the window, where the orange glow of the nursery light still burned faintly above. "As long as they're safe, I'll be fine." At that same hour, Dr. Everett, the family physician, arrived unannounced, his coat damp from the evening mist. He was a kindly man in his 60s with a face that carried both wisdom and weariness. He had attended the Harringtons for years, including Amelia, during her final moments. Edward greeted him with a nod. "You're here late, Doctor." "I came as soon as I received your message this morning," Dr. Everett said. "I wanted to see how the twins were doing after last night's storm. And to speak with you about Miss Johnson." Edward stiffened. "Ah. The talk of the household, I presume." "Indeed," the doctor replied gently. "I've just examined your children. They're in remarkable health considering what they endured. You owe that maid more than dismissal, Edward. You owe her thanks." Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think I should apologize to a servant?" The doctor's tone was firm but kind. "I think you should look at your son and ask yourself if pride would have kept him breathing." The sentence landed like a hammer blow. Dr. Everett continued, pacing slowly. "When I arrived this morning, I found her still there, cradling the boy. She refused to sleep until she knew both were safe. She didn't do it for reward or recognition, she did it because that's who she is." Amelia would have called it grace. The name of his late wife cut through Edward like a blade. Amelia. The doctor was right, she would have admired Clara's courage. He remembered Amelia's gentleness, her compassion for people regardless of their station. It was that kindness that had once drawn him to her, and the loss of it that had hardened him beyond repair. Edward turned to the window, his reflection framed against the darkening sky. "She's leaving tonight," he murmured. "Then stop her," said Dr. Everett quietly. "Before you lose more than just a maid." When the doctor left, the words echoed in Edward's mind long after the sound of his carriage faded. Stop her. For a long moment, he stood still, torn between pride and something that felt perilously close to repentance. Then, without another thought, he grabbed his coat and stepped into the hall. The house was dim now, lit only by oil lamps. As he descended the servants' staircase, the faint hum of Clara's voice reached his ears, a soft tune, the same lullaby from the stormy night. He followed the sound until he reached the back corridor. There she was, standing by the kitchen door, her satchel in hand, ready to leave. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw him. "Sir," she said quietly. Edward hesitated at first, then spoke, his voice unsteady in a way it had never been before. "Clara. I was wrong." The words seemed to hang between them, fragile and sincere. "You shouldn't have had to protect my children. That was my duty. And yet, you did it better than I ever could." Clara looked at him, uncertain whether to speak. "You don't owe me words, sir. Only kindness to those little ones." But Edward shook his head. "I owe you more than words. I owe you my gratitude, and my respect." He paused, then added, "If you're willing, I'd like you to stay. As their nanny. Not their maid." Clara's eyes widened, shimmering with disbelief. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," he said softly. "For them, and maybe, for me to learn what I've forgotten." For the first time since Amelia's death, Edward's voice carried warmth, hesitant, human. Clara hesitated, her heart torn between caution and compassion. Finally, she nodded. "I'll stay for the children, sir. As long as they need me." Edward exhaled, relief and humility washing through him. Then perhaps this house might finally have a bit of light again. As she followed him back up the stairs, the distant sound of thunder rolled one last time, not the sound of danger, but of something being cleansed. And in that vast, quiet mansion, a single truth echoed through every corridor. Sometimes love does not rise from grand gestures or fine words, it rises from the floor, where the humble dare to kneel. The next morning rose slow and golden, like forgiveness finding its way into a long-shuttered room. A thin fog still hugged the gardens, curling through the marble arches of the Harrington estate, but sunlight pierced it in narrow beams that reached all the way into the nursery. For the first time in months, the house did not feel haunted, it breathed. Edward Harrington stood by the window, watching those beams of light fall across his children. Henry slept soundly in his cradle, Eleanor lay beside him, her tiny hand curled into a fist around the edge of her blanket. On the rug near them, Clara sat cross-legged, quietly mending a tear in the boy's sleeve. Every movement she made was soft, deliberate, thread gliding through fabric like calm through chaos. Edward had been standing there for several minutes before she even noticed him. When she did, she began to rise, flustered. "Sir, forgive me. I thought you wouldn't be needing me this early." He lifted a hand gently. "Please. Stay seated." The tone startled her. It wasn't the clipped, commanding voice she knew. It was lower now, softer, like a man learning to speak again after years of silence. He took a step closer, his polished shoes silent on the carpet. "They sleep better when you're here," he said quietly. "The house itself feels quieter." Clara blinked, uncertain whether it was a compliment or confession. "Children know who means them well, sir. They can feel it even before they understand it." Edward nodded slowly, looking down at his son's tiny chest rising and falling. "I didn't realize how fragile life was until last night," he said. "I've spent my whole existence building walls around myself, thinking they would keep pain out. But I see now they only kept love from getting in." Clara said nothing. She merely continued to stitch, her needle catching the morning light like a sliver of truth. For the rest of the morning, Edward remained near the nursery. The servants whispered about it in disbelief, the master, who once avoided the children's floor entirely, now lingering there like a man who just discovered air. When Henry awoke, crying softly, Edward hesitated, then reached down awkwardly to lift him. Clara guided him without a word, her hands showing him how to cradle the boy's neck, how to sway just right. "Like this?" he asked, his voice almost boyish. "Exactly like that," she smiled. "He's listening to your heartbeat now. It tells him he's safe." Edward looked down at the tiny face pressed against his chest. For a brief moment, his throat tightened. Something inside him shifted, a pressure he hadn't even known was there released all at once. He realized that for all his wealth, he had never held anything so valuable. Later, over breakfast, he surprised everyone by joining the staff in the smaller dining hall instead of eating alone. He thanked the cook for her meal, praised the gardener for keeping the grounds despite the storm, and when Mr. Wallace entered, expecting orders, Edward merely said, "Good morning, Wallace. You should rest today, you've worked enough." The butler nearly dropped his tea. After breakfast, Edward walked the estate grounds with Clara and the twins. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. He found himself pointing out the pond where Amelia used to sit, the rosebush she had planted by hand. "She loved this place," he murmured. "I buried myself in work after she passed, but I see now that I was burying her memory instead of honoring it." Clara adjusted the shawl around Eleanor and said softly, "Grief doesn't fade, sir. It only learns to live beside love if we let it." Her words settled deep. They reminded him of Amelia's wisdom, the same quiet strength that had once drawn him in. For the first time, he saw Clara not as a servant but as a soul carrying her own battles with grace. When they returned to the house, Edward entered the study and pulled open a drawer long locked away. Inside lay an envelope yellowed with age, Amelia's handwriting on the front. He hadn't read it since the funeral. With trembling fingers, he unfolded it. "If anything should happen to me, promise me you'll let love stay in this house. Promise me our children will always be held, not just watched over." He closed his eyes, emotion surging through him like the breaking of a dam. That evening, he asked Clara to join him in the parlor. The room glowed with the amber light of the fire. She stood nervously near the doorway, unsure of why she'd been summoned. "Clara," he began, "I've been a blind man walking through his own home. You taught me to see again." He reached into his coat and placed an envelope on the table between them. "This is for you. Your wages tripled, and I've changed your title officially. You are no longer the maid. You are the children's guardian and head nurse. This house is as much yours to care for as mine." Clara's hands trembled as she took the envelope. "Sir, I can't accept." "You can," he interrupted gently. "Because what you gave me cannot be measured in money." Her eyes shimmered in the firelight. "I only did what anyone with a heart should do." He smiled faintly. "Then it's time I start doing the same." Over the next few days, change swept through the Harrington mansion like spring thawing the last of winter. Edward joined the children's breakfast each morning. The laughter that had vanished since Amelia's death began to echo once more through the halls. He installed new heating in the servants' quarters, personally oversaw repairs in the nursery, and dismissed the cruel head steward who had ruled the household through fear. Even the staff began to walk taller. The mansion, once a cold monument to loss, became a living home again. Yet the greatest change was quiet and unseen, the transformation inside Edward himself. He found solace in simple things: Eleanor's first attempt at saying "Papa," Henry's fascination with the gold buttons on his coat, Clara's laughter drifting down the corridor as she played peekaboo with them. Every evening, he would pause by the nursery door, leaning against the frame, watching as Clara hummed them to sleep. Her song filled the air like a prayer, a promise that love could survive even the harshest winters. One night, as he stood there longer than usual, she noticed him and smiled. "You're learning, sir," she whispered. "Learning?" he asked. She nodded toward the sleeping twins. "That love isn't taught by words, it's remembered through touch." Her words lingered long after she left. That night, Edward sat by the fire, the twins' photograph on the mantel beside Amelia's portrait. He realized the ache in his chest had changed. It wasn't emptiness anymore, it was gratitude. When dawn came again, the first thing he heard was laughter, real, unguarded laughter. The sound drew him to the nursery, where the twins were sitting on a blanket, giggling as Clara pretended to chase them with a toy rabbit. Edward laughed, too, softly, unexpectedly, like a man waking from a long sleep. Clara looked up, her smile warm. "You see, sir. They don't need perfection. Just presence." He nodded, his eyes bright with understanding. "And you've given them both." Outside, the sunlight broke through the last of the fog, scattering gold across the gardens. The roses glistened with dew, the pond shimmered like glass, and the house that had once felt hollow now pulsed with life. In that moment, Edward knew this truth would guide him for the rest of his days: wealth could buy safety, but only love could bring peace, and love, he had learned, was not found above others, but beside them. The man who once stood alone at the top of the staircase had finally descended, not in defeat, but in grace. And as the twins' laughter carried through the house, Edward Harrington realized the miracle he'd been given, not just the return of family, but the awakening of his heart. The Harrington estate had never known laughter like this before. Not even during Amelia's life had it sounded so full, so unguarded, so utterly alive. It rang through marble halls that once only carried the echo of Edward's footsteps and the sigh of the old grandfather clock. Now, those same corridors hummed with warmth, the delicate babbling of the twins, Clara's gentle singing, and the occasional chuckle from a man rediscovering the art of joy. It began, as all miracles do, quietly. Spring had come early that year. The magnolias lining the drive burst into blossom weeks ahead of schedule, their petals drifting like confetti in the breeze. For the first time since Amelia's passing, Edward noticed them. He stopped beneath the blooming trees one morning with Eleanor perched on his arm, her little hands reaching for the blossoms. "Pretty," she cooed, her first clear word. Edward laughed softly, his chest swelling. "Yes, my darling. Very pretty." He plucked one bloom and tucked it behind her ear. "Your mother loved these flowers." From the veranda, Clara watched the scene with a smile that was both proud and tender. The transformation she had witnessed in the past weeks still astonished her. Edward, once a ghost moving through his own wealth, was now a father in every sense of the word. He had learned to braid Eleanor's curls, to carry Henry on his shoulders without fear of musing his expensive suits, to kneel when the children called, not just as a gesture of affection, but of humility. The staff noticed too. The mansion that had once felt like a gilded prison now thrummed with belonging. Meals in the great dining hall no longer carried the tension of rank, laughter was allowed, kindness encouraged. Mrs. Lane began humming hymns as she worked. The kitchen smelled perpetually of baking bread. Even the old butler, Mr. Wallace, who had once measured his worth by silence, was seen smiling as he polished the silver. And at the center of it all stood Clara Johnson, the maid who had once been invisible. Now she was the quiet heart of the household. One morning, as she guided the twins through their lessons in the nursery, Edward appeared at the doorway. He leaned against the frame, watching as Clara held up alphabet cards. Henry clapped wildly when she showed him the letter H. "That one's for your name, Henry," she said, beaming. "And for Harrington," Edward added with a grin. Clara turned, startled. "Oh, sir, I didn't hear you come in." He stepped forward, crouching beside his son. "You're teaching them well. They're bright children," she said softly. "Their mama must have been proud." Edward nodded, his expression wistful. "Amelia would have adored you, Clara. She always said compassion was the rarest form of intelligence." The words made Clara lower her gaze, humbled. "I'm just doing what love tells me to do." Edward studied her for a moment longer, not as a master appraising a servant, but as a man seeing another soul's quiet nobility. "Then love," he said gently, "has given this house back its soul." That night, as twilight descended and a golden haze filled the rooms, Edward gathered the entire staff in the main hall. The chandeliers glittered like constellations above them. Clara, unaware of his reason, stood at the back, her hands clasped nervously. Edward cleared his throat, his deep voice echoing. "Many of you have served this house faithfully for years. Through loss, through silence, through grief. But in all my time as master, I never truly understood what it means to lead. Leadership without compassion is tyranny. Wealth without love is poverty." He paused, his gaze finding Clara. "This house has known both. Until now." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Last month," he continued, "I was a man who measured life by what I owned. Then one stormy night, someone reminded me what truly matters. She did not have money, title, or power, only courage and heart. And that proved to be worth more than everything else I possess." He stepped aside and motioned for Clara to come forward. The murmurs grew louder. She hesitated, confused, her cheeks flushing as all eyes turned to her. "Miss Clara Johnson," Edward said, his voice warm but steady, "from this day forward, you are no longer a servant of this household. You are its guardian. You saved my children's lives and, unknowingly, their father's soul. I am officially naming you as the Harringtons' chief caretaker, and a member of this family." For a heartbeat, the hall went completely silent. Then applause broke out, tentative at first, then thunderous. Mrs. Lane wept openly. Even Mr. Wallace wiped a tear from his spectacles. Clara stood frozen, trembling. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Edward smiled. "Then say nothing. Just stay, as you always have. Because this house, these children, and I, we need you." Tears glistened on her cheeks as she bowed her head. "Thank you, sir. I'll do my best to honor that trust." "You already have," he said softly. The days that followed carried the rhythm of a home reborn. The newspapers wrote about the transformation of the Harrington estate, but no one outside truly understood that the miracle wasn't in the mansion's new gardens or the philanthropy Edward began funding. The real miracle lived within the walls, in the quiet exchanges of care, the laughter of children, the unspoken grace between two hearts learning to trust the light again. In time, Edward opened a charitable foundation in Amelia's name, one that provided education and shelter for orphans and domestic workers. He insisted that Clara oversee it. "You understand what love looks like when it's on the floor," he told her. You'll teach the world to stand with it. Under Clara's guidance, the foundation flourished. Girls who once scrubbed floors now learned to read. Families without means found homes. Every act of kindness seemed to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the gates of the estate. But for Edward, the greatest joy remained close to home, the sight of his twins running across the grand lawn at sunset, their laughter mingling with Clara's. Sometimes, as he watched them from the veranda, he would think of that stormy night and shudder to imagine what might have been if she hadn't disobeyed him. One evening, years later, Henry, now a curious 5-year-old, climbed into his father's lap and asked, "Papa, why do you always say Miss Clara is part of our family? She's not our blood." Edward smiled, brushing his son's hair from his forehead. "Because, my boy, blood makes you related, but love makes you family." Henry nodded thoughtfully, as though he understood something far beyond his years. Then he leapt down and ran toward Clara, who was planting flowers by the gate. She laughed as he threw his arms around her waist. Edward watched them, the sunset bathing everything in gold. The estate glowed, not from chandeliers or wealth, but from the warmth of living hearts. For the first time in his life, Edward Harrington understood the true meaning of his fortune. It was not in the marble or the money, but in the mercy that had walked barefoot across his floors. And so, they called it, quietly among the servants, and later, among the townsfolk, the miracle of the mansion. Because sometimes, the grandest transformations don't happen in cathedrals or on battlefields. Sometimes, they happen in nurseries, when a maid lies down on the cold floor beside 2 crying children and teaches the world's richest man how to love again. Years passed like gentle tides across the golden lawns of the Harrington estate. Time softened everything it touched, the grief that had once haunted the halls, the echoes of thunder from that long-ago storm, even the sharpness of Edward's once iron pride. The mansion that had once stood as a monument to wealth now breathed like a living thing, filled with the laughter of children, the scent of magnolias, and the quiet hum of everyday miracles. The twins had grown. Henry, now 12, carried his father's curiosity and his mother's tenderness. Eleanor, thoughtful and bright, had inherited Amelia's grace but also Clara's courage. Together, they filled the world around them with light. Their voices could often be heard through the open windows, reading stories aloud, practicing piano, or chasing each other down the corridors that had once only echoed with loneliness. And through it all, Clara Johnson remained at the center, the quiet pulse of their home. Her hair had begun to streak with silver, her hands lined from years of service, yet her presence still held the same warmth that once shielded 2 infants from a storm. To the children, she was Miss Clara, but in truth, she was much more. She was the compass that had guided them, the heart that had never faltered. Edward Harrington, now grayer himself, often found her in the nursery that had once been their battlefield. It was no longer a room of cold marble and polished gold but a sunlit haven, books on every shelf, drawings pinned to the walls, soft laughter woven into the very air. One afternoon, he paused at the doorway, leaning lightly against the frame. Clara sat by the window, sewing a loose button back onto Henry's school coat. The boy stood nearby, fidgeting as only boys do. "You never stay still," she teased gently. "How do you expect me to fix it if you keep dancing like a windmill?" Henry grinned. "Papa says patience is learned, not given." Edward smiled faintly. "Your father is right," he said, stepping in. "Though he still struggles with that lesson himself." They all laughed. It was the kind of laughter that heals, simple, pure, unguarded. When the twins left for their lessons, Edward remained. For a moment, he said nothing, simply watching Clara fold the mended coat with care. Then, quietly, he spoke. Do you ever think about that night? Her hands paused. She didn't need to ask which night he meant. Every time it rains, she said softly. I still hear their cries sometimes. But not in fear anymore. In gratitude. Edward's gaze drifted toward the window, where the first hint of rain was beginning to streak the glass. It changed everything, he murmured. Not just for them. For me. For all of us. He turned to her then, the weight of years resting lightly in his eyes. Clara, I was a man of marble, proud, polished, and hollow. You cracked that stone. You taught me that love isn't something a man commands, it's something he earns. Clara's lips curved into a gentle smile. And you learned beautifully, sir. He chuckled softly. You still call me, sir. After all these years. She tilted her head. Habit, I suppose. Respect, too. He shook his head with warmth. Respect should be mutual. And it is. You've been more than a caretaker in this home, Clara. You've been its conscience. Outside, thunder rumbled softly, not angry this time, just distant and low, like the echo of a memory too kind to frighten. Edward crossed to the mantel, where framed photographs stood, Amelia's portrait, the twins as infants, and a recent one of all four of them together, taken last Christmas. In it, Clara sat between the children, smiling as though she had never known a life before this one. I sometimes wonder, Edward said slowly, how different things might have been if I'd seen you clearly sooner. Clara shook her head. Life gives us lessons when our hearts are ready. To listen. Not before. Her words hung in the air like gospel truth. That evening, the family gathered for dinner as they did every Sunday. The table glowed under soft candlelight. The twins recounted their week, Henry's science project, Eleanor's piano recital. The servants, now treated as extended family, joined in the laughter. Mrs. Lane clapped her hands in delight at every story. Mr. Wallace, older and gentler now, poured the wine with the steadiness of ritual. At the head of the table, Edward looked around and felt something he hadn't known even as a younger man, the fullness of peace. He raised his glass. To family, he said. Not the kind that is written in blood, but the kind that is written in love. They all echoed softly, to family. Later that night, after the twins had gone to bed and the last candle had burned low, Edward stepped out onto the terrace. Rain had begun to fall again, whispering over the gardens, tapping against the marble balustrade. He closed his eyes and smiled. It no longer sounded like grief, it sounded like grace. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. Clara joined him, draping a shawl around her shoulders. You shouldn't be standing in the rain, sir, she said. Old habits, he replied. I used to hide from storms. Now I listen to them. They stood side by side, watching the rain trace silver paths down the glass panes. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it was sacred, the kind that exists between souls who have walked through fire and found something holy on the other side. After a moment, Edward spoke, his voice low. I've been thinking of setting up a new trust. For children without homes, those who were never given what mine had. I'd like it to bear your name, Clara. The Johnson Trust. Her head turned sharply. Oh, no, sir. That's too much. It's not nearly enough, he interrupted gently. Your kindness deserves to be remembered long after both of us are gone. This house, these children, they're your. To listen. Not before. Her words hung in the air like gospel truth. That evening, the family gathered for dinner as they did every Sunday. The table glowed under soft candlelight. The twins recounted their week, Henry's science project, Eleanor's piano recital. The servants, now treated as extended family, joined in the laughter. Mrs. Lane clapped her hands in delight at every story. Mr. Wallace, older and gentler now, poured the wine with the steadiness of ritual. At the head of the table, Edward looked around and felt something he hadn't known even as a younger man, the fullness of peace. He raised his glass. "To family," he said. "Not the kind that is written in blood, but the kind that is written in love." They all echoed softly, "To family." Later that night, after the twins had gone to bed and the last candle had burned low, Edward stepped out onto the terrace. Rain had begun to fall again, whispering over the gardens, tapping against the marble balustrade. He closed his eyes and smiled. It no longer sounded like grief, it sounded like grace. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. Clara joined him, draping a shawl around her shoulders. "You shouldn't be standing in the rain, sir," she said. "Old habits," he replied. "I used to hide from storms. Now I listen to them." They stood side by side, watching the rain trace silver paths down the glass panes. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it was sacred, the kind that exists between souls who have walked through fire and found something holy on the other side. After a moment, Edward spoke, his voice low. "I've been thinking of setting up a new trust. For children without homes, those who were never given what mine had. I'd like it to bear your name, Clara. The Johnson Trust." Her head turned sharply. "Oh, no, sir. That's too much." "It's not nearly enough," he interrupted gently. "Your kindness deserves to be remembered long after both of us are gone. This house, these children, they're your legacy as much as mine." Clara's eyes glistened in the rainlight. "If you believe that, sir, then I have already been repaid 1,000 times over." He smiled faintly, his gaze soft. "You've always been the wiser one." A flash of lightning illuminated them both, not in contrast, but in unity. Two figures standing beneath the same roof, bound not by class or circumstance, but by a shared truth that wealth could never buy, love that endures. Years later, when the twins became adults and the Harrington estate passed into their care, the staff would often tell visitors the story of the maid who slept on the floor. They spoke of the night the storm came, the child who almost didn't make it, and the father who found redemption through humility. But the story was never told with pity, only reverence. Because in their version, it wasn't a tale of tragedy, it was a testament to grace. And when Edward grew too old to climb the grand staircase, Clara was there beside him, steady as ever. She read aloud to him by the fire, just as she had read to the twins long ago. Sometimes, he would fall asleep mid-sentence, the sound of her voice the last thing he heard, the same sound that had once soothed his children through a storm. One quiet morning, years later, as dawn gilded the windows of the estate, Edward passed peacefully in his chair. The last smile on his face was soft and knowing. He had died not a tycoon, not a man of stature, but a man of peace. At his funeral, the priest's words carried through the air, "Blessed are those who love without measure, for theirs is the kingdom built not of stone, but of compassion." Clara stood by the casket, tears glistening but heart full. The twins, now grown, flanked her, their hands wrapped around hers. And when the service ended, Eleanor whispered to her, "He said you taught him what love means." Clara's voice trembled, but her eyes were bright. "No, child," she said softly. He taught himself. I only reminded him where to look. The sun broke through the clouds then, bathing them in gold. And as they walked back toward the mansion, the house that had once been cold marble and silence, it glowed with a warmth that could only come from one truth, whispered forever through its halls. Love, when it's real, kneels down, it doesn't stand above.